Divest Invest Philanthropy, managing the foundation sector for the broader Divest Invest movement, which now spans universities, sovereign wealth funds, cities, pension funds, insurance companies, health organizations, faith groups, and individuals. Until June 2015, Clara served as an account director for climate and energy at Fenton Communications. There, she led client efforts on a range of campaigns, including Divest Invest, anti-fracking, defending climate science, and the clean energy transition. Before joining Fenton in June of 2013, Clara was Director of Leadership Initiatives at the Climate Works Foundation, where she worked promoting global and national policies to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Clara is a frequent speaker and writer on climate change. She sits on the board of directors of 2 Degrees Investing Initiative, a multi-stakeholder think tank working to align the financial sector with the 2 degrees centigrade climate goals. She is also a member of 350 NYC. Please welcome Clara Vondrich.
Thank you so much, Monica. We've known each other now for a few years, working in our capacities at 350, and it's a pleasure to see you at demonstrations and to rally with you and to feel your spirit and energy whenever I'm participating. It's really strong and a force of nature that we all need to see more of. Thank you yes, Monica, yes. So I wanted to begin by mentioning that I'm in the middle of a yoga teacher training. Yoga is one of my passions in addition to climate change. It's what's keeping me grounded in the midst of all the bad news. It's very easy to become overwhelmed and discouraged when you hear about the fact that we knew 25 years ago how bad things were with climate change, and yet emissions are still steadily increasing rather than decreasing. So I wanted to start this morning with a brief meditation, if you wouldn't mind indulging me. If we could all just close our eyes for a moment. And this is just a chakra meditation. We're just going to move through the energy centers of the body, trying to focus on each one individually, and really sending your attention there. Meditation is all only about becoming in touch with the present moment. It's about trying to notice thoughts rather than identify with them. So if you could just listen along and try to focus on the instructions, that would be great. So let's start by focusing in the lowest part of our sort of pelvic floor area at the base of our bodies. This is called the root chakra. It's identified with the color red. This is your animal body. This is identified with really sort of your more primal nature. And it's really important. It sounds as if it might be a negative, but in fact, being in touch with your root chakra is essential to remaining grounded. And so imagine a red rose just blooming in this area of your body, and send a few breaths down there and send your attention there. Now let's move up to the lower belly. This is the second chakra. It's kind of identified more with a sense of starting to, well, it's where your genitals are located, so there's a lot of sexual energy that is sort of built into this chakra. It's where procreation, fertility, those kinds of things are rooted, and it's associated with the color orange. So just send a few breaths down into this orange second chakra. Now let's move just a little bit higher up to the navel point. This is the third chakra, identified with the color yellow. You can also imagine a beautiful blooming yellow flower here. This is also identified with your solar plexus, really about starting to follow your intuition and your ideas that come from sort of a higher part of your mind rather than the thinking mind. Now take a deep breath and move up to your heart. This is now the fourth chakra, or heart chakra. It's associated with the color green. And of course, the heart chakra is really about compassion. But first, before compassion for others, it's about compassion for yourself. Send a few breaths there. Now let's move up to the throat. This is the fifth chakra, the throat chakra, associated with the color blue. And the throat chakra is really about it's about, you would think it's about finding your voice, but it's really more about non-judgment. When we focus on the throat chakra, it's about non-judgment of people, places, and things, understanding that they are how they are, and that's enough. Now move up to your third eye center. This is the third eye chakra, or sixth chakra, and it's associated with the color indigo. And this is, again, this is your higher mind really starting to tune into divine will and spiritual intuition. The third chakra is also about intuition, but it's more about the 3D reality that we find ourselves in. You're at a fork in the road with respect to a career, you choose one based on intuition. That's the third chakra. The sixth chakra at your third eye center is more about intuition regarding your relationship with God. And finally, moving up to the crown chakra, the seventh one at the crown of your head. This is associated with the color violet. And this is really where we have a gateway to the divine. And this is a progression. You can focus on these kinds of energy centers, and eventually I've been able to, over the course of my training, really start to feel something different in each one. So it's a nice practice, and now we can just gently open our eyes, come back to the present moment. Thank you so much for indulging me. I just like to practice what I preach, and right now I'm in the middle of yoga training, and so I wanted to open with that. But now back to the matter at hand, divest, invest. So I've been working in climate change circles for about 10 years now, 15 if you want to be more technical about it. I was a lawyer practicing in private practice before sort of switching careers in 2006 or so. I wanted to share with you a few things about the movement. First, let me just do some definitions. So you may have all heard, I'm sure you're all familiar with divestment as a principle. Bill McKibben has popularized it. It's this idea of divesting institutional or individual portfolios from coal, oil, and gas. But my campaign, our campaign, has the added differentiation that it's about divest and invest. Because you can't have one without the other. It's really about moving out of the problem and getting into the solution. What Paris showed us is that we need a wholesale transition of our entire economic system from fossil fuels to clean energy sources. And that's only going to happen if we shift capital alongside. The money has to flow from coal, oil, and gas production, exploration, existing plants, and it has to move from them into solar, wind, water, alternative technologies that we need now and into the future in order to decarbonize our economy. And it's not enough to bring emissions downwards. They actually have to become nearly flat by 2050 if we want to meet the Paris promise. And that's because carbon dioxide is a long-lived gas that persists in the atmosphere. So a molecule of carbon that you put up 100 years ago is still there today warming the planet. And so that means that it's not enough just to decrease emissions, we have to bring them to nearly zero. And another way of thinking about that is decarbonizing our economy, which means that by 2050, if we want to stay on this pathway that world governments agreed to in Paris, we cannot put more carbon into the atmosphere. Our energy system will have to be entirely carbon-free by then. And that's a daunting job, especially if you look around New York City today. If you travel, you undoubtedly fly, you drive a car. This fossil fuel infrastructure is baked in, and we're gonna have to unbake it and basically remake the entire world as we know it. Divest Invest is an extremely powerful tool because it goes to the belly of the beast. It goes to the money. It goes to the heart of the most powerful industry on the planet, and that's the fossil fuel industry. And it says, we are not going to support you as investors with our money. We're taking our business elsewhere. We're taking it over to the clean energy future that we know that we have to seed, and we have to seed it now. There is no more time to waste. And for many, when this got going, like in 2011, there was so much pushback. Just a little bit of history. So in 2010, this is post-Copenhagen, where the world leaders failed to agree on a climate treaty that would start to bring emissions down. It was really viewed by the climate community as a huge disappointment. There was so much hope built into it. People really thought that Copenhagen was going to be a turning point. But as we know, in the 11th hour, they were unable to reach a deal. Oh, Apologies. They were unable to reach a deal in Copenhagen. Is it possible to lift this up or? The whole podium? The whole podium lifts? Oh. Ah, okay. You guys are high tech. Nice. There seems to be a lavalier too. Does that work? Oh, okay. So, Copenhagen. Yes, so there was a major disappointment in Copenhagen. The climate community was pretty crushed. Here in the US, we had tried to pass Waxman-Markey, which was an economy-wide climate bill that would have put a price on carbon. That won in the House of Representatives. People got very excited, but then it didn't pass muster in the Senate, unfortunately, and the bill was dead. So where did that leave the climate community? I was working at ClimateWorks Foundation at the time, a huge, $1 billion plus endowed institution whose mission was to limit climate change to 2 degrees. They had thrown so much money into supporting Copenhagen, into Waxman-Markey. Similarly, Hewlett Foundation, Packard, all the big ones that focus on environment had really put all of their eggs into these baskets. And what did they have to show for it? That then created a moment of deep soul searching. You may have heard of a Harvard scholar named Theda Skocpol. She wrote a really great essay that I commend to all of you. It's more like a research paper talking about why the climate movement had faltered and failed. And her conclusion was that it had left the most important cards on the table, and those cards were the people. Those cards were the people power and the power of individuals like you and me to organize and make change. The foundations that I mentioned, Hewlett, ClimateWorks, Packard, that had put so many resources into Copenhagen and Waxman-Markey, they did this from a very top-down level. They organized meetings with policymakers, they went to lobby people on Capitol Hill, they did all these things in a sort of top-down, behind closed doors kind of fashion. They didn't engage the grassroots, and the proof was in the pudding. So Theda Skocpol's conclusion was that the people have to be engaged, the grassroots have to be supported, and this is a key to success on climate. So here we are, a fractured climate movement, people were down, we were looking for a new way forward. Wallace Global Fund, a DC-based foundation led by Ellen Dorsey, one of my mentors, she was at a coal funders meeting in spring of 2011, and they were noticing how there was a growing body of students on American college campuses that were interested in pursuing coal divestment. And many in the community worried that this was not a good tactic because in 2011, coal was still going very strong. And the idea that we would somehow weaken the power of one of the most powerful industries on earth was scary and daunting. But the funders persevered. They decided that they would fund some of these first coal divestment movements on student campuses. So it started with 7, then it went to about 12, and by the end of that year, there were 65 coal divestment movements on college campuses nationwide. Enter Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein. Summer of 2011, Bill McKibben wrote the Rolling Stone article called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, and that was a game changer. This is the article where he laid out the carbon budget and carbon bubble analysis that he had been inspired by Carbon Tracker to write about. And this was the idea which you are all familiar with, the idea that we have 5 times as many coal, gas, and oil reserves in the ground as we can safely burn to remain on this 2-degree trajectory that scientists, global policymakers all agree would be devastating to cross. So it follows that if 4/5 have to remain in the ground and they can't be burned, then if you take it to its logical conclusion, investors that are sitting on those funds, investors in coal, oil, and gas companies, are actually sitting on a carbon bubble. Now, there were many voices at the time that were very pessimistic and skeptical. They said, these reserves will be burned no matter what. And that's something that we've had to fight the entire time because people are so familiar with business as usual. We have an economy that runs on fossil fuels. There's no way that we can change. But we persisted in this argument that 3/4 of the reserves have to remain underground, and if that's true, then those assets that are on the balance sheets of these companies are stranded assets whose economic value will never be realized. And it follows that investors, again, who are sitting on those assets that hold those stocks, are sitting on a carbon bubble. So Bill McKibben then took his analysis on the road in the Do the Math tour in the fall of 2012. By the end of the next year, there were now 200 student divestment movements on college campuses. Enter the foundation sector in January 2014. The first cohort of Divest, Invest Philanthropy was launched, and it was 14 small, mid-sized foundations, not a lot of gravitas, but the idea was that foundations, being mission-based organizations, much like the Society for Ethical Culture and other NGOs, because of their tax status, their charity tax status, they receive tax breaks because they have a duty to uphold the public good. It followed that if you are basically invested in fossil fuels which are directly or indirectly undercutting the power of the planet to survive, then you are not truly aligned with your mission, and perhaps you should take a closer look, a hard look at your investments, because they're not aligned with your values. So these first foundations came out and said, we want to align our investments with our values. And so therefore, we're going to divest and, again, the innovation I mentioned, invest a portion of our endowments into climate solutions, because we have to see the full life cycle change now. And the pushback was real. The pushback about financial returns being undercut. So many in the financial community at that time said this is irresponsible. For an endowed institution to divest from fossil fuels is irresponsible because the fiduciary duty is to maximize profits at all costs. Okay? So the idea that as a foundation you give out 5% of your grants in charitable giving each year to further and support the mission that you care about, but then you can have 95% of those investments in something else, other industries that may be undercutting that mission, that wasn't, people didn't take a close look at that. They were focused on the idea that those returns had to be maximized so that you could continue to give out these grants every year. So we decided to sort of sit back. We used the moral argument very strongly that it was wrong to invest in companies and industries that were destroying the earth. And we decided to focus really intently on that moral argument because we didn't yet have the evidence yet that the financial arguments were wrong, which we have subsequently found to be true. So moving forward to the fall of 2014, we had our first big announcement here in New York City. We had a big press conference where we announced that the Rockefeller Brothers Fund was divesting from fossil fuels. And that was a moment where the world started to notice. Because here you had this iconic family whose wealth and fame was built around the discovery of oil and turning it into one of the biggest industries on earth. And suddenly, they recognized that they had a moral obligation as a foundation, as a mission-based organization, to get out of those fossil fuels. And that irony was really captivating to the press. We were able to generate a lot of global press around the world. And the executive director of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Stephen Hines, he said, if John D. Rockefeller were alive today, as a prudent businessman, he would be divesting and reinvesting. So that was a powerful moment, and the world started to notice. Our organizing at that point took on a new power and a new momentum. By fall of 2015, pre-Paris last year, there were 500 institutions around the world with $3.4 trillion in assets under management that had made some form of divestment commitment. That's really significant. The year before, there were $50 billion in assets under management. We leapfrogged to $3.4 trillion in 1 year. That's a 55-fold increase. And that was because of a couple of factors. The first and foremost, I think, And I'll be honest, we were really buoyed and helped by financial trends. The coal sector tanked over this period of time. Coal stocks have literally declined close to 98, 99%. Peabody Coal, Arch Coal, the big ones have gone out of business. They're bankrupt. They're in bankruptcy proceedings right now. So returning back to that financial argument that I mentioned, while the moral case was always first and foremost, all of a sudden the financial arguments for divestment started to catch up. And all of a sudden it became clear that getting out of fossil fuels was the prudent financial choice. And that just that was like a turbocharge the entire movement, because now all of a sudden you could do the right thing and have the benefit of making money. So that moment then catalyzed a whole new string of commitments. You saw global insurers like AXA and Allianz, multi-billion-dollar corporations, insurance companies, divest. You had the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund divest from coal, the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. Today you have very, very powerful divestment movements in Europe, in Australia, the UK, and just last week we announced our first cohort of Canadian foundations. They've been a little slow in the uptake, partially because of their energy politics. You know, they're the home of the tar sands. It's a very fraught environment, and many of the foundations, even those focused on the environment, have a hard time coming out in favor of divestment for those reasons. But we have been persevering, and we announced our first cohort of foundations from Canada last week. So why is divestment working, and what's the point? Are we really going to shift enough dollars through this movement in order to affect the great energy transition? No, we're not going to do it alone. This is about combining the power of governments, the private sector, individuals, and civil society in general. The governments in Paris agreed to limit warming to no more than 2 degrees centigrade with a target of 1.5. That was huge, of course. I mean, above 1.5 degrees warming, most of the low-lying island nations are done. But the only way that this is going to happen, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, is if we have a wholesale transformation in our economy from brown to green choices, that we decarbonize. And the focus of the governments has been all along on incentives, really transitioning energy markets through a use of incentives like carbon pricing. Now I believe that close to 30 of the countries signatories to the Paris Treaty have some form of carbon pricing, and shame on the US for not having that yet. There are a few states, obviously, like California and Washington State and others, where there's some form of carbon trading or pricing happening, but nationally our climate policy is woefully underdeveloped. So the only way that the governments are going to be able to meet this promise is if we all work together. And Christiana Figueres, who's the head of the UNFFC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the governing body for the Paris talks and Copenhagen before it, she said that divest invest was one of the primary factors of a positive conclusion in Paris. And that was because the movement gave politicians a sense that there was wind at their backs, that there was a populace watching and cheering them on, and also holding them accountable. And she, as the head of that process, has been quoted as saying that she really views this as a movement that is changing the world. So I'm so proud to be part of it. All of us can be part of the movement. This is the other beauty and the power of it, is that it's extremely democratic, because we all, whether we have alma mater that we went to, or we're part of an organization like the Society for Ethical Culture or other endowed nonprofits, we can urge them, we can call on them to divest from fossil fuels and instead put their money in truly the growth industries of the future. It's no longer just a moral-based argument. This is about doing what's right fiscally, financially, and this is my final point. This is actually one of the game changers that I think we're about to see, and legally. So I was speaking with Bob earlier, and he was mentioning as the, is it the chief financial officer for the Ethical Society? That he had a duty to maximize profits, and that there was a sense that it would be against his fiduciary duty to divest. Beavis Longstreth he's a former commissioner of the Securities Exchange Commission. He has written a 6-page guidance document outlining the reasons why divestment is actually a fiduciary duty for mission-based institutions especially. And this analysis, he's hoping to get sign-on from attorneys general in various states, starting with New York and California. And if that happens, there will be precedent, legal precedents, for divestment being not only within fiduciary duty, but being the fiduciary duty. And there are similar analyses that have taken place in the UK. There's a guy named Christopher McCall, he's a barrister there, who's written a similar analysis, and also Ed Waitzer in Canada, who in our Canadian press release last week, he mentioned that divestment would soon be an enforceable obligation. So I'm just gonna leave it there. I firmly urge all of you to visit the Divest Invest website, really check out some of the arguments for divestment and reinvestment. As an individual, you can pledge on the Divest Invest individual page, which is linked there on the web, on the homepage. And you can also link in to the university, faith, and other movements through 350.org, which has been a stalwart leader of this movement, and we really value our partnership with them. And whenever we do these press conferences each year, 350 is right by our side because we're all in this together. So I wanted to thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Administration, assuming she comes in as president, how aligned is she with your vision and goals? I hope a good deal, but I'd like your opinion.
This is something that now I'm going to speak outside of my capacity as director of Divest Invest and more from a personal level. I view her climate policies as woefully incremental. The fact that she supported at one point drilling in the Arctic, that she continues to talk about natural gas as a necessary bridge, these are all very worrisome to me. Very worrisome to me. That being said, I think we have a lot to thank Bernie Sanders for in terms of pushing her further to the left. I don't even like to say left, but pushing her to be more ambitious with her policies. And this notion that she also has John Podesta by her side. And John Podesta was the head of the Center for American Progress and a huge climate hawk. And he is somebody who I think will continue to make sure that she's following a North Star on climate. She's not my first choice, but I think, you know, if we remain vigilant, if we remain there to put the pressure on and hold her accountable, you know, we might avert catastrophe. Yes, you were, yes.
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
Is that Momo just signed in that any institute that goes for divestment is not going to be embraced or financially supported
I'm
by.
going to interrupt. That has nothing to do with fossil fuels. That's a whole other issue.
But it's divestment.
No, it's not for fossil fuels. It's a bigger issue.
Okay, all right,
So,
then
yeah, let's fix it.
all right, then I'll go the other way. I feel like the fossil fuel industry, which really is a monopoly, if you go into the whole thing of Rockefeller, doesn't matter how many, the seven sisters, as they call it, and all like that, that and what's going down now, which as a people, because I went to the Ralph Nader breakingthroughpower.org,
Mm-hmm.
and basically the thing that scared me the most was when I listened to, and I've seen the 25 pages of the secret text that had been revealed in November of the TPP, which would give total sovereignty or total dominance, even supersede the Supreme Court. Domestic and foreign corporations can come on.
What's the question?
My question is, do you think that this is a last push for these companies to try and hold on to what they have? Do you think we'll be able to overdo this? Of course, telling your Congress and your senators to vote against it is one thing, but then do you think that this is their last push? Because of everything you told me, it seems like we still have one that. Do you think it's our last push?
First, they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. So I absolutely think that they're now entering the sort of fight phase, fighting for their lives, and you see that in a very concrete way in the movement. They have, last year Peabody Coal put in its securities filings that Divest Invest was a threat to its returns, to its performance, and subsequently, some of the big oil majors have started to be very, very critical of divestment, really raising the specter of diminished returns and you'll undercut your financial performance if you divest. I mean, they are really the loudest ones propagating these arguments, despite the fact that now we have 3 years of evidence by our signatories and other divesting institutions that their returns have only increased since they've made this decision, okay? And so yeah, this is David and Goliath right now, and you better believe that TPP and other frameworks like that are kind of their last, efforts to hold on to power and to really legalize and to embed their power into the future. So it's very important that we all keep fighting those kinds of trade agreements.
Is there any talk of divesting from cattle?
From cattle?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Due to the unsustainability of a meat-based
Yeah.
system.
It's a great question. So to get started, we focused on fossil fuels because they were the most obvious culprit. Fossil fuels are, I think, over half of all global emissions. And investors, one of the biggest considerations for a money manager or portfolio manager is diversification. And you have to diversify your portfolio according to the classical theory so that you can minimize your risk. And so anytime you take a sector out of that portfolio, you're arguably increasing risk. So we didn't want to free people out in the beginning and ask for so much. And I don't think that as a movement we're gonna go there. But that said, I agree with you wholeheartedly that a meat-based culture, and especially having a developing world that is looking to emulate our meat eating habits, is devastating. And I can't tell everyone to be a vegetarian. I eat fish occasionally, and it's a personal decision. But I hope that as time moves forward, people will recognize that even limiting their meat intake can make a huge difference. Yeah.
I have a question about, you said that getting the common people, grassroots behind you is important. And I wonder if you've considered the power of the movies, not the documentary kind, which most common people avoid, but the fiction kind, as in the space aliens invading the Earth, that's how we're going to end. What if you could get Hollywood to make a global warming ending the Earth rather than space aliens? Because global warming is more likely to end the Earth.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that's a brilliant point. And there was a movie that came out. What was it called? What? Day After Tomorrow. That's the one I'm familiar with. Yeah. That was pretty freaky, but it was about like an instant freezing, right, of the world. But you're hitting something that's so key, which is the divestment movement is still talking to itself. We're still talking to itself. We're preaching to the preacher, we're preaching to the choir, and we need to move beyond that. And so many, and this is where yoga comes back. So many in our culture are just living this, never-ending stimulation, consume media, consume Facebook, consume movies, that they're not grounded, they're not connected with with the eternal, with things that are really lasting and true. But that doesn't negate the fact that we have to meet them where they are. And so your point about engaging Hollywood and some of those icons is key. And last year, actually at our press conference, I didn't mention, but Leonardo DiCaprio came out and divested not only his foundation, but also his personal wealth. And he was at our press conference last year. And this year, Oh, by the way, another actor that you're probably all familiar with, the activist Mark Ruffalo, has also divested, who's fantastic. You've probably all seen him at a rally or two. This year, I've had the great fortune of being connected with Adrian Grenier, who's an actor that's on the show Entourage. I'd never seen it, and it's actually pretty bad. But he's really excited. He was inspired by Leo's commitment last year, and he wants to organize for this year's press conference a gaggle of celebrities, a group of celebrities to all come together and do it jointly. So stay tuned. And not only are they going to commit to Divest Invest, but they're going to commit to be ambassadors for the cause, unleashing the power of their social media and other platforms in order to educate, inspire, and engage these people that you're talking about. So thank you. That's a great point.
So, thank you.
You're welcome.
I would just say that the function here in investing is not to maximize return, but to guard the equity value that we have.
Mm-hmm.
If we wanted to maximize returns, we could invest in guns too.
Mm-hmm.
But I would also point out that when somebody sells stock, divests from a fossil fuel company, it doesn't take any money away from the company, it just reduces the market capitalization because the stock price will fall. On the other hand, you say invest in alternate fuels, alternate means.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that? Because if you buy stock in existing companies, you just give money to the shareholders who sell you the stock. So how does one actually invest in growing a new infrastructure for new energy methods?
Mm-hmm. Great questions. On the first point, there's two things to keep in mind. One is that when really big institutional investors like sovereign wealth funds, global insurers worth close to $1 trillion divest, it actually does make a difference to the pocketbooks of the fossil fuel companies. It increases their rate of borrowing. It becomes harder for them to raise money from the banks. And the fact is, we're starting to see those kinds of huge institutional commitments. And when it's happens in mass, it becomes a wave. And there have been analyses that show that already it's becoming harder for fossil fuel companies to take out money in order to boost their exploration for new reserves, which is exactly what we're trying to achieve. Not only can we not burn 4/5 of what's in the ground, but these companies are spending close to $500 billion each year looking for new reserves beyond the ones that we can't burn. So the fact that their cost of borrowing is going up and they can no longer get as easy access to capital to do this new exploration is a great thing. The second point is that the power of divestment doesn't just lie in this undercutting the financial credibility of these companies, but their reputational credibility. Their status in society as good actors. Around the world, you have people whose lives are completely their futures are at risk because of climate change, and there's no question that these companies have foisted a conspiracy, basically a clouding and a disinformation campaign for the last 25 years. You guys have all seen the Exxon New, research and disclosures, and it's really there's not even a word that's strong enough to describe what they've done. And the idea that they still can, go around the world being held in regard and held in esteem, and basically their big talking point now is that the divestment movement is irresponsible because the developing world still needs fossil fuels to develop. No, we have extant technologies today that these companies can adopt. They can leapfrog fossil fuels. There's no reason that they need to go the way that we did and develop the same way we did. And in fact, if they do, we are all SOL, okay? So that's point number two. And then your third point about investing. So as a representative for foundations, we're looking at all of the asset classes in the portfolio: stocks, bonds, private equity, real estate, and cash or cash equivalents. And in each of those categories, there are investable options. There's direct deals. You can actually invest in, through the alternative equity classes, a renewable energy project like a solar wind farm. You can basically buy a bond on a 20-year power purchase agreement for a solar farm. This is what Warren Buffett has done. He's put out some of the biggest bonds on these new wind farms that he's developing in the Midwest through Mid-America, his company. So there are investable products that have a direct impact. And investing in a Tesla or investing in a solar city, I mean, that's also there are equities that you can invest in and make a difference. We absolutely have to capitalize these companies that are changing the world. And they're actually, over time, especially as the economy transitions more and more, these are going to be the growth industries that are the ones, the Apples, the Teslas, the next big thing that investors will really profit from financially. And as I mentioned, it's a win-win because you can feel good about where you're putting your money.
Last question.
Yes.
So when you meet someone, we all might have friends that clearly say, oh, climate change is nonsense. And, I would like to, one, know how you respond to that. I mean, or what you can say in a reasonable way without being unreasonable, because it's so frustrating. You can't believe that some of your friends that are smart are actually saying those things. And then the second thing is, when we leave here today, what's our homework assignment? What can we do? What can we all do besides being a cheerleader and going to your website? What can we do to help the cause?
Talking to climate skeptics is one of the most patience-trying exercises that I know of, but it's a great opportunity to practice. And it's a great opportunity to practice tolerance, acceptance, and listening. Listening is the most important one, right? Because I get in there, I'm all ready to go with my arguments, and I'm not actually hearing them. And I've had the great benefit of becoming friends with a number of Republicans that are actually working on carbon pricing in Washington. There's this guy, Eli Lehrer, who left the Heartland Institute after their weird billboard campaigns comparing climate believers to Ted Kaczynski. I don't know if you remember those from 5 years ago. Anyway, he was like, okay, this is too much, even for me. So he moved to DC, he opened something called the R Street Institute, and it's a conservative libertarian think tank that's working on carbon pricing, because to them, as a group that recognizes climate change is real, a price on carbon is a much better alternative to government regulation, something like a cap and trade thing that would just, or EPA regulation that would hamstring business. So talking to them and hearing their concerns and learning more about their philosophy and what guides them, they're not a true denier, but still they're on the other side of the fence. And we've learned to meet each other, not in the middle, but we've both made small steps forward because we developed trust and a relationship. With people that dig in their heels and just deny, I just don't really talk to them because if you're that solid, if you're that certain in your views, there's so many people that that may not be sure and that just need more information, and I'd rather spend my energy working with them. And especially if someone gets angry, at that point I just really have to take a step back, because I have to protect my own energy and my own sense of what's good and true in this world. And frankly, there's a profit-making business behind the disinformation. It's the fossil fuel industry sowing disinformation. So especially with one of their henchmen or people that are out there being the propagandists. I mean, I'm not going to spend time talking to them. But you raise a really important point that I don't have a great answer for. I think listening is really key. You can point, obviously the facts are there, but I've found that throwing out facts, like 99% of all climate scientists worldwide agree, they'll just say that's not true. There's a lot more debate than that. So for every fact that you throw out, they're just going to throw, my experience is that it's tit for tat. So connecting on a more feeling level, developing the relationship, developing trust first, I think is the key to moving a heart or mind on this issue. You don't always have time for that. And then your second point, listen, we can all divest. You can divest your personal endowment, that's a little strong. I definitely don't have an endowment. But if you have for example, if you hold any mutual funds or a retirement fund, for example, I've gone ahead and switched all of my IRAs and mutual funds and 401ks actually to fossil-free options. It's available to anybody. There's resources on the Divest Invest individual page. Moving the money, again, like I mentioned, it's the belly of the beast. It's pretty important. And then just separately from that, do what you're doing. Be part of the actions that take place here in New York City. We're so blessed to live in New York City where so much goes on. Join 350 NYC. You know, come support the various efforts, whether it's blocking new fossil infrastructure or the divestment movement or one of the many other campaigns. You can find one that really resonates. And I find personally that what invigorates me is the ability to feel at least like I'm making a small difference. You know, I can fall into deep despair if I'm not doing anything. And so I think the best antidote to despair is action. So get active. Yeah.